year is 2012. Mercedes driver, 91-time Grand Prix winner, 7-time world champion and all-around F1 legend Michael Schumacher sits down with James Roberts of the F1 Racing magazine to answer some readers' questions. One reader asks how it feels to be passed by drivers half his age on the racetrack. Schumacher shrugs and says he doesn't think about it. Another reader asks him what really happened to the Suzuka Circuit Hotel log cabin bar on the night he won the 2000 World Championship. Schumacher assures them that they must be thinking of his brother Ralph. And then Carolyn Riley Smith's question is put to Schumacher, and she asks who Michael's racing hero was when he was growing up. Ayrton Senna is mentioned, naturally. One of the greatest drivers of all time, the vast majority of F1 stars past and present have all idolised the legendary Brazilian. But that's not the only name Michael says. Senna is the second name he mentions. What Michael says first is, to start with, it was Vincenzo Sospiri. Vincenzo Sospiri. A name that casual racing fans will shrug at and say, sorry, who? A name that seasoned veterans who've combed through every F1 encyclopedia under the sun, myself included, will pull our noses up from those tomes and say, wait, really? So, who is this Vincenzo Sospiri chap? And why is a man ranked alongside Ayrton Senna by Michael Schumacher as a racing inspiration not remembered in the history books alongside those two racing giants? Vincenzo Sospiri was born on the 7th of October 1966 in Forli, in the same Emilia-Romagna region of Italy that now gives its name to the racer Imola. In a region so close to an iconic circuit surrounded by the homes of racing giants like Lamborghini, Maserati and Ferrari, it perhaps wasn't too much of a shock that Sospiri was bitten by the racing bug. At 15 he began his karting career, and what a career it was! Across the next few years he dominated the karting scene, hoovering up Italian and European titles on a yearly basis, and on the rare occasion that he wasn't winning a championship, he was almost always runner-up, highlighting his consistency alongside his clear raw speed. It culminated with the World Karting Championship in 1987, and with that, it was time to move on up the motorsport ladder. By 1988, it was time to head across to the home of motor racing and the place where comedy programs become very quickly outdated. Britain, Britain, Britain. Stepping up to racing cars, he raced in Formula Ford that year, winning 9 races, as well as the coveted Formula Ford Festival title, adding his name to past luminaries Johnny Herbert and Eddie Irvine, and would be joined by future stars Mark Webber and Jenson Button. A difficult 1989 in British Formula 3 and Formula Opel Lotus was bettered in 1990 as he duelled with future F1 race winners Rubens Barrichello and David Coulthard. Barrichello beat him to the Formula Opel Lotus crown, but he hit back to become Formula Vauxhall champion. His 1990 performances caught the attention of eagle-eyed talent spotter Eddie Jordan and his Formula 3000 team, a series which you might know nowadays as Formula 2, which is approximately 1,500 times worse than what it used to be. A spot had opened up for one race, and despite scarcely any testing, Sospiri dived straight in, and was rewarded with an 8th place finish on his debut, but failed to qualify for the season finale. He signed up for a full season in 1991 alongside future world champion Damon Hill, and hopes were high all around. After all, despite only joining Formula 3000 4 years ago, Jordan had firmly established themselves as race winners and regular frontrunners. Unfortunately for Vincenzo, 91 was the worst possible time to join them. Jordan Grand Prix had just graduated to F1 that year, meaning most of Eddie's attention was focused on that new adventure. The Lola chassis, formerly so dominant, was now outclassed by the Reynard chassis, and both Sospiri and Hill subsequently struggled. There was a 4th at Mugello and a brilliant 2nd in Hockenheim, but those were the only high points, and Sospiri wound up 8th, just behind Hill. Without the money required for another season, it was a drop back down the racing ladder for 92 into Italian Formula 3. 1 win and 23 points ranked him 5th, ahead of another future F1 race winner, this time Giancarlo Fisichella. It was back up to Formula 3000 for 93, albeit in the latest of last-minute moves. Just 1 week before the first race of the year, he signed for the new Mythos racing team. So late was the signing, on the same day he signed, the team went to collect their chassis and drove to Donington for the first race without any time to paint the car, let alone test it. That excused his slow start to the year, but by round 4 he was on the podium, and with 16 points he placed 7th overall, placing himself firmly back in stock in the shop front of potential F1 drivers. That quietly consistent campaign had attracted the interest of F1 newcomers Simtek, who invited Vincenzo to test with them pre-season. He impressed, but sadly the contents of his wallet proved dustier than a MotoGP rider going through a gravel trap, and without the funds to back him, the seat went to Austrian Roland Ratzenberger instead. So it was back to Formula 3000 for another year, where he'd team up with infamous F1 legend Taki Inoue. Friends since racing in Formula Ford, they went together to newcomers Supernova, Sospiri supplying the talent, and Inoue supplying the sponsors, and, trying his best. 3 podiums came his way, but that first win refused to come. Heading to the 6th round in Spa, he was part of a cluster of drivers battling for the championship, but a crash before the race saw him break his hand, and though he was back by the next round, that crash and the missed victory opportunities cost him dearly, as he wound up 4th, 12 points shy of champion Jean-Christophe Bouillon. It was a consistent but frustrating campaign, which racing magazine Autosport echoed, noting that he sometimes lacked application and was blindingly quick, yet surprisingly ordinary. He wasn't the champion, but he was the clear number 1 in the team. He'd comfortably outscored Inoue 24 points to 0, and his 3 podiums dwarfed Taki's best result of 9th. Both were invited to test for Simtek before the Japanese Grand Prix, and going on comparisons, Sospiri was clearly the more talented of the two. So, of course, it was Inoue who was given the nod to make his F1 debut over the Italian. Some might say it was a shrewd move on behalf of Simtek, placing the Japanese driver with home advantage and experience in the car. The vast majority would say it was the large bag marked swag that Inoue brought into the garage with him. Sospiri could only watch from the sidelines as his friends spun off in the rain, and then promptly secured a contract with Footwork Arrows for 1995, paying $500,000 a month for his drive. The outrageous nature and quantity of incidents Inoue was involved in during his brief F1 tenure confirmed that it was money, and not talent, that had taken him that far. And so Sospiri found himself still in Formula 3000 for a 4th year, still with Supernova, and now joined by Brazilian Ricardo Rosset, who had finished 5th in British Formula 3 the previous year. And as the saying that literally no one says goes, the 4th time's a charm. Supernova were the team to beat that year, and from 8 races, Sospiri took 3 wins and 2 further podiums to wrap up the title at the penultimate round in Estoril. Junior Series glory had been attained, and now it was on to replicate that success in the big leagues. F1, here we come, Sospiri must have thought. Except, it's rarely as straightforward as that. When it comes to Formula 3000, GP2, F2, Mario Kart Double Dash, whatever you want to call it, it's never as simple as win title, tick, instantly catapult yourself into F1 with Ferrari or McLaren or whoever, double tick. There's so many other factors in place, your paddock connections, the sponsorship you can bring to a team, the manner in which you won your title and the time you've spent in the junior series. That last point was the big sticking point for Vincenzo. At some point you pass a threshold of being the next young thing, and you become the experienced old hand to act as a benchmark for the next wave of talents to be judged against. The results you pull out become less of an achievement for you, and more a barometer to be compared alongside. The harsh truth was that it had taken Sospiri 4 years to climb to the top of the Formula 3000 pile, which didn't look impressive when compared along someone like teammate Rosset, who was younger, a championship runner-up in his rookie season, and not to mention flush with sponsorship cash. Maybe it was for that reason there wasn't a huge amount of buzz around Sospiri at the end of the year. Compared to nowadays and the commotion and swirling tornado of seats that the media were attempting to crowbar Oscar Piastri into at the end of 2021, the noise around Sospiri was closer to the awkward silence a table finds when the waiter brings out the bill. Despite that lack of clamour for Vincenzo, the door to F1 had still peeked itself open for him. A seat had opened up at midfielders Ligier, and a Formula 3000 champion seemed as logical a fit for that role as any. After testing at Mugello at the end of the year, it looked like that seat had the scrawl of Vincenzo Sospiri written all over it. Talent alone hadn't been enough to secure him the seat, but the combination of that plus an estimated $4 million in sponsorship from a series of Japanese companies that Sospiri and Supernova boss David Sears had scrounged together looked set to do it. That was until the day Sospiri was poised to sign the contract, where he was promptly informed that 40 driver Pedro Diniz had offered Ligier $8 million worth of sponsorship, and that was a figure that the Italian just couldn't match, even after a quick rummage in his wallet failed to bring up an extra $4 million. It's a feeling we all know well. And so Sospiri, the champion, watched on as the Brazilian duo of Rosset and Tarso Marquez got to move up to F1 for 96, and Sospiri did not. A test driver role was all he could hope to secure, and whilst a role with old Formula 3000 colleagues Jordan was mooted, in the end it was reigning world champions Benetton who grabbed his signature as a test driver. Some were quick to connect the dots of Italian driver joining a team eager to grow its image as an Italian operation, but his Formula 3000 championship showed he was more than just his nationality. It might not have been the race seat Vincenzo wanted, but it was a fantastic prospect nonetheless. It was an opportunity to work alongside two of the highest rated drivers on the grid in Gerhard Berger and John Alesi, as well as the likes of famed F1 figures like Ross Brawn, Pat Simmons and Flavio Briatore, in an established championship-winning operation. Throughout 96, Sospiri carried out 26 days worth of testing, and in such an experienced environment, even Vincenzo confessed he was a much better driver by the year's end because of his time as a test driver. Supposedly, he had almost been promoted to a race seat for the 96 Monaco Grand Prix, though the reasons for why and how and who appear to have been scattered to the winds. At a race where famously only 4 cars were classified at the end, who knows where Sospiri could have ended up that day? But no one heads into F1 with the dream of sitting on the sidelines and watching others race wheel to wheel for the thrill of victory. Benetton were keen to keep Sospiri on, but the lure of racing was too strong for him. Ironically, if he'd stayed at Benetton, he would have made his debut for them that year, as Gerhard Berger was ruled out of 3 races through illness, and replacement Alex Wurz would grab a podium in his absence and go on to race for Benetton for the next 3 years, taking several points finishes. A peek through a Doctor Strange-esque multiverse would show Sospiri there instead of Wurz perhaps. But that was in June of 97, and it was in January that Eric Broadley and MasterCard Lola came knocking with a 4-year contract to go racing that year. And unlike his previous flirtations with a drive with Simtek and Ligier, Lola were much more experienced and required a lot less sponsorship. Founded back in 1958 by Broadley, Lola had been in and out of F1 since the 60s, never as a team in their own right, but designing and building cars for others. John Surtees put his Lola on pole in their first ever Grand Prix, making them part of an elite club of only 8 teams to have also done so, which includes the likes of Mercedes and Brawn. 2 podiums came that year, and what followed thereafter for Lola was the dictionary definition of a dabble in F1, supplying chassis to the likes of Graham Hill's Embassy team in the 70s, and LaRousse between 87 and 91, with Aguri Suzuki returning a Lola car to the podium at the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix. Throughout that time, there was plenty of success elsewhere in Formula 2, Formula 5000, and across the pond in kart. But Broadley had always wanted his own F1 team. Throughout the 90s, there had been plenty of rumours and conjecture of a Lola factory effort. Concepts had been doodled on the backs of napkins, and a full prototype was made and tested by future Le Mans legend Alan McNish in 1995. All that was missing was a few dollary dues to get the project up and running, and in 96 Broadley was able to put together a deal with credit card giants MasterCard for MasterCard Lola to join the Grand Prix circus in 1998. It was a very attractive prospect for any young budding driver. A well-known, experienced name in Grand Prix racing, a big sponsor with plenty of backing, and though the team would be powered by outdated and underpowered Ford Zetec V8 engines that backmarkers 40 had used in 96, that wasn't a concern for a team with realistic aims for the future. For 1998, all that mattered was reliability, not power, and a gradual move up the field in latter years. On paper, it was the perfect combination for any driver. Experience, money, security, realistic expectations. But a quick track analysis of any circuit in the world will tell you that Grand Prix don't take place on paper. and there's an important contradiction in what I've just said that would come back to bite Lola in the bottom. By now, you might well have crunched the numbers and realised something is slightly amiss here. We've just spoken about how Lola were gearing up for a return in 98, but Sospiri would be racing for them in 97. There's a reason those numbers don't add up, and that reason would be the beginning of Lola's downfall. The plan was indeed to join Formula One in 1998. The problem was, that was Lola's plan. MasterCard, on the other hand, wanted to join F1 in 97. Lola's fellow F1 newcomers Stewart Grand Prix would be making their debut in 97, and splattered across the tartan cars was MasterCard's rival banking corporation HSBC. MasterCard weren't going to allow a little thing like not actually being ready to enter F1 to allow their competitors to get the jump on them in the sponsorship market. And so in November of 96, MasterCard forced Lola's hand by demanding the team entered F1 in 97, or they'd pull all their backing. Lola, with no other cash revenue to rely upon, relented. All of a sudden, what should have been a year's worth of work was having to be very quickly fast-tracked. There are many things in life you can rush. Doing your homework on the bus, speedrunning your favourite video games. One of the things you cannot rush is entering Formula One. Stewart had first announced their intention to join F1 in January of 96, and in November that year were proudly showing off their new F1 car. Conversely, Lola were just starting to sit down and design theirs. You can already see the downward direction this is heading. Broadley might have waxed lyrical about the team's experience, commitment and desire to succeed, but the fact was that so rushed was the car put together, it never even got to sit in a wind tunnel. The car and team launched on February 20th, leaving time for a quick shakedown but not time for any serious testing before the cars needed to head to Australia for round 1. If Sospiri was looking for a sign of how successful this partnership would be, he got it. Upon leaving the pits to begin his day of testing, the car immediately caught fire. And the next day, just 9 laps were completed, and no more than 2 at a time. And whilst new teammate and old rival Ricardo Rosset managed to squeeze out around 50 laps across the 2 days after that, the situation was pretty clear to both drivers. The list of everything wrong could have been theatrically unravelled and rolled out of the garage. Fundamental aerodynamic flaws, complete lack of grip, an inability to warm tyres, a lack of downforce whilst cornering, somehow too much drag whilst running in a straight line. The car could not drive in a straight line without something going wrong. How was Sospiri going to rescue his maiden F1 season in such an atrocious car? But Sospiri, despite all that, remained optimistic. No one was kidding themselves about the difficulties they'd be facing. It wouldn't be easy, but driver and team would learn together and plan to be better down the road. You had to admire his confidence in the face of such difficulties. The 1997 season kicked off in Australia, and the Lola team were forced to pull a series of all-nighters just to have both cars able to take to the track. With the power of hindsight, maybe they shouldn't have bothered. Michael Schumacher's Ferrari was fastest in first practice on a 1:32.4. 8.6 seconds behind him was Rosset, and a further 1.4 seconds behind his teammate was Sospiri. The man who had inspired the then 2-time world champion could only dream of pulling a performance out of his Lola like Schumacher was doing in his Ferrari. The car had no balance, no grip, and subsequently, no pace. It wasn't much better in second practice. In a session where cars typically go faster as track conditions improve, both Lolas went slower, with Sospiri's best time dropping from a 1:42.5 to a 1:44.2. At the same time, everyone else was going quicker, with Jacques Villeneuve's Williams setting the then fastest ever lap around Albert Park with a 1:28.5, 13 seconds faster than Rosset and just shy of 16 seconds faster than Sospiri. Drivers who failed to set a qualifying time within 107% of the pole time would fail to qualify for the race, and it looked a foregone conclusion that neither of the Lolas would be allowed to race on Sunday. Now would be a good time for the part of the story where the underdog finds a miraculous cure out of nowhere and stuns their rivals into silence. and as qualifying descended, Sospiri put in a sterling effort to improve with his best time of the weekend, a 1:40.9. The question was, would that be enough to make the grid? Not quite. Well, not even close. Villeneuve was on pole with a 1:29.3, 11.5 seconds faster than Vincenzo, making the cut-off mark for 107%, a 1:35.6. Not even some crash team racing like shortcuts would help make up the time required. In Sospiri's defence, he was at least faster than Rosset by 1.1 seconds, and was having to compete against one of the most dominant pole times in recent history. Villeneuve was over a second and a half clear of his teammate Heinz-Harald Frentzen. You had to go back to Belgium 1992 and Nigel Mansell's all-conquering Williams for the last time the margin between first and second had been so big. Even the teams who hadn't slapped their cars together with hopes and prayers struggled to keep within 107% of Villeneuve's time, with Pedro Diniz, Sospiri's Ligier seat-stealing nemesis, also failing to match that time in his arrows. Of course, the near-impossible benchmark time certainly didn't help things, but even adjusting the 107% time for a more achievable target of Frentzen's time, Sospiri would have still been 3.4 seconds away from making the grid. Afterwards, Sospiri admitted what most of the world had been thinking. We knew we weren't competitive, but we didn't know it would be that bad. He noted the difficulty of the handling in the corners and a lack of aerodynamic grip that even made travelling in a straight line extremely tricky. Both Sospiri and some team members were even debating whether the car was slower than a Formula 3000 car. Despite that frankly embarrassing opening effort, Vincenzo remained optimistic. The only way was up from here. New parts and more development were planned for the near future, as well as a custom-built in-house V10 engine, whose increase in power would surely trample over their outdated Ford editions. Even if there was another DNQ in Brazil, hopefully with more preparation and track time, they could start solving their worries. But when Vincenzo turned up to the Grand Prix paddock, he found there was one worry that was definitely unsolvable. The team had collapsed, without telling either of their drivers. Rumours had swirled that Lola were already in trouble, but it wasn't until Sospiri and Rosset landed in Brazil that newspapers were brandished in their faces that confirmed the grim news. MasterCard, arguably the culprit behind their Australia struggles, had gone, and subsequently so had all the other sponsors. Lola's Grand Prix division was £6 million in debt, and no money meant no F1 team, and no F1 team meant no more F1 dream for one Vincenzo Sospiri. What to do now? As it happened, the next step in Sospiri's racing journey came about very quickly, whilst he was still in Sao Paulo in fact. An Italian journalist based in America called, with news from Indy Racing League's Team Scandia. They wanted to enter a car for him to race in America, all expenses paid and with bundles of prize money available. Sospiri probably took one glance back at his old MasterCard mule and didn't take too long to tell Team Scandia, "I'm in." Despite a lack of testing time, he qualified an astonishing third in his first ever race, a little known event known as the Indy 500. He ran inside the top 10 before an electrical issue sent him to the pits just after the halfway mark. A couple of top 10 finishes did come his way later on, not to mention an outstanding drive to second place at the Pennzoil 200, losing out by just 0.064 seconds at the line. The offer was there for more Indy racing with Scandia in '98, but Sospiri couldn't do it. It was a great experience, but his heart and soul belonged to F1, and so it was back across the pond to try and chase that F1 dream again. It was perhaps a decision driven by the heart rather than the head, because there was no openings for him, and the little demand for Vincenzo that had existed pre-Lola had all but evaporated. All he could do was dabble in sports cars across the next 2 years where, to his credit, teammate Emmanuel Collard and he took consecutive sports racing World Cup titles in a Ferrari, winning 6 out of 8 races in 1998. That sports car success prompted a crack at the Le Mans 24 Hours in 98 and 99. And whilst 98 was uneventful, in 99 he shared the lead Toyota with Collard and Martin Brundle. They took pole, but gearbox problems and a puncture took them out. There was a brief flirtation with kart at the end of '98, but it was an anonymous few races, and that was the end of his open-wheeled racing journey. There was one final race for Sospiri at the beginning of 2001 at the Sebring 12 Hours, but the car failed after 47 laps, and that was that for Vincenzo. He and old colleague David Sears established Euronova Racing that year to guide young drivers through the junior series, with the likes of Robert Kubica, Antonio Giovinazzi and Vitaly Petrov all passing through the Euronova ranks. In 2015, Sospiri's team switched to GT Racing, citing how hard it was for young drivers to enter F1, and how he hated giving false hope to his protégés. Whereas in GT Racing, becoming an official driver was much more realistic. A life lesson through critical self-reflection, perhaps. Now called Vincenzo Sospiri Racing, it's not an uncommon sight to see the Lamborghinis his team runs taking the checkered flag first, and seeing Sospiri celebrate alongside his drivers on the podium, an image that mixes a tinge of happiness and regret. To Sospiri's credit, he has always defended his decision to leave the Benetton test roll for the Lola race drive, citing that it was a right decision because it was an F1 seat. And maybe you hadn't heard of Sospiri before watching this, but if that's the case, then you certainly hadn't heard of Jörg Müller, Bjorn Verdheim or Bruno Junqueira, all equally talented Formula 3000 champions who all got trapped in test driver roles and never got to fulfill their life goals of making it in F1. A solitary DNQ to your name isn't much to sniff at, but it's better than not even dipping one tyre onto the circuit for qualifying. Sospiri's tale is a tale as old as time in F1 circles. The junior series legend who never got his fair break and could only watch as those he'd duelled with won titles and trophies, and those he'd beaten arguably unfairly jumped his place in the queue for F1 for careers with little in the way of results. And instead of being rewarded for his efforts, instead became a man with a sole race entry to his name, a single DNQ attached to his place in the history books and not even classified in the final standings. The MasterCard Lola tale is told and retold like a children's cautionary tale to prospective F1 entrants, in which Sospiri merely acts as a side character, powerless to stop the unstoppable, disastrous narrative. A stark reminder that in F1, talent is not enough, and may well never be enough. And yet, despite all this, Michael Schumacher names him as an inspiration? Of course, I'm being select with the details here. Was Sospiri an inspiration for his F1 exploits? Clearly not. Obviously not. But if we jump back in time to the dominant teenager winning everything and anything in his sights on the karting circuit, those were the exploits that inspired Schumacher. And aren't we lucky that he did? If that young man from Forlì in Italy hadn't raced karts, then maybe another young man from Kerpen in Germany might have had an entirely different career. We should remember and thank Sospiri for his exploits that inspired Schumacher, but we should remember the man in his own right too, in the way that Schumacher would have done. Ayrton Senna once described karting as pure driving and pure racing. No politics and no money, just real racing. And maybe that's the way we should be remembering Vincenzo Sospiri. Not for his F1 exploits and the disasters from it, but as one of the fastest and purest racers that some of the greatest have ever seen. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.